to our evening with Jess Walter talking about the cold millions. My name is Slavin Lee. I'm the executive director of the, yay, thank you. I'm the executive director of the Missoula Public Library. I want to acknowledge that the Missoula Public Library sits on the ancestral homeland of the Bitterroot, Salish, and Kalispel peoples. These lands were acquired by dispossession and attempts at deliberate and systemic destruction of indigenous culture. We recognize that acknowledging the colonial past of Montana and upholding indigenous voices helps us all move forward collectively. Missoula Public Library commits to actively working to increase indigenous engagement and access by providing welcoming spaces on their homeland, which also celebrates and showcases indigenous voices through programming, art displays, art collection, and signage.
Tonight, the NEA Big Read is a program of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest. Programs and events are presented in partnership with the Missoula Public Library Foundation, the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, the Friends of the Missoula Public Library, and with support from the NEA. I want to thank every group that I just mentioned for making this possible. I also want to thank the library staff who put together such an amazing lineup of programs and events for you in the next month or so. And I want to thank Jess for coming to Missoula County. And finally, I want to thank Commissioner Josh Slotnick for being here. He'll be moderating the program tonight, and he will introduce Jess to you. Thank you all so much.
Thanks a lot, Slavin, and thank you all for coming. And I want to thank Jess right away for coming. Missoula is the kind of place where if you swing your arms wildly, you'll probably hit 2 or 3 published authors, but none of them could say they're a #1 New York Times best-selling author. None of them have reached, very few have reached the level of national acclaim that Mr. Walter has, and it's truly an honor to have you here. So I want to give you a little rundown on how this is going to work, and then I'll do my last little bit of intro. Mr. Walter is going to read, present, speak on his book. I'll ask a few questions to get things started, and then we'll hand the microphone, or the proverbial microphone, to you all, and we'll do a whole bunch of Q&A, and we'll go for a while. We'll go as long as Mr. Walter would like to go. So, Jess Walter is the #1 New York Times best-selling author of 10 books. Most recently, the novels The Cold Millions and Beautiful Rains, and the story collection We Live in Water. He was a National Book Award finalist for The Zero and won an Edgar Award for Citizen Vince. His work has been published, this is amazing, in 34 languages. How many of us could name 34 languages, right? And this one really got me personally. His short stories have appeared 3 times in the Best American Short Stories, which I get from my mom every year at Christmas and eagerly anticipate. And for someone to have one story in that collection once would be pretty spectacular. But 3 times, you may be the only person in that category. So with that, Jess Walter. Thank you. Does this one work?
Oh, there it is. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Commissioner Slotnick. Thank you, Slavin, and everyone at the library. What a beautiful library you have. Yeah. I get sort of emotional about libraries. My 2 favorite scenes in the book take place in libraries. And to me, they sort of frame what this novel is about, which is opportunity and this sort of egalitarian ideal that I grew up with. And to me, I feel most like an American and proud of that when I walk in a library. And so this NEA program to go from Maine to Alaska to California now to the best of them all, Missoula, it's amazing to see these great libraries. And it's so great to be back in Missoula. My brother and I have come here as Eastern fans, and we've decided this is the best place in America to lose a football game. The one time we were here that Eastern won, it was so boring going out at night. And we've already been to the Mo Club and had a burger, just reliving old times. And it's so great to see family here, see friends. My first and best newspaper editor is here, probably still going to edit me at some point and tell me I'm going on too long. And family, friends, and family. My niece is a freshman at U of M. I have no idea why. We couldn't talk her out of it, but she seems to love it. And so my brother's here, and my cousin, who has made the family proud by going into labor organization and education. Because this book really does start with family. It starts with my dad, who was a committed union man. And so I grew up in a family where labor was a kind of church. It was what we thought was the way the world should be organized, as a sense of fairness and lifting everyone up. And my dad was a real working class guy. He was fairly baffled by what I do for a living, I have to admit. He was giving me want ads up until his last years, circling things that he thought I might be able to do. Until one time I took him to an event in Spokane. It was just packed. And I remember him looking around, and he never bought lunch after that. It was always on me. But I would go out and talk about, I would have to go on book tour, and I remember Dad being sort of confused by that. He would say, "What do you do on book tour?" And I'd say, "Well, I go to universities and libraries and bookstores, and and I read from the book." And he said, "You wrote the damn thing, you have to read it to them too?" And I said, "No, Dad, they read it themselves. I just mostly answer questions." So I would really want you to think about questions. That is my favorite part of things like this, is wanting to know what you want to know about. But before that, I'll talk a little bit about the book. It really starts, as most of my books do, with the idea of what it is that I'm walking around thinking about, bedeviled by, what I sort of want to get across. And in the years 2016, 17, 18, 19, I was really troubled by the state of America, and specifically the idea of income inequality. And I also at that time was thinking about my dad and about unions and labor. And at this point, I'm going to call up, this is going to be the shortest PowerPoint presentation you'll ever see. It is exactly one slide. So this is the share of income going to the top 10%. On the far left here, over before 1925, is about the period of the cold millions. On the other side, of course, you can see where we are now. And you can see labor union membership going in that same direction. Now, I'm not saying, that's it for the PowerPoint, thank you. Now, unions are not a panacea. There is no human institution that can't be corrupted or misused or have too much power or misuse its power. But that chart shows you exactly the thing that I was thinking about as I set out to write this novel. So many of the problems that we face in our communities, and every community faces them: homelessness, drug abuse, crime. These are really issues of income inequality. They are really the fact that your grandfather might have had a pension at work. Where is all your wealth? It's in your home. Most of us, our wealth is, and it's great to live in the interior West now because we're all Zillow drunk. We're just walking around, my house doubled in value. Forget the fact that if you sell it, you have to buy another house that has doubled in value. But the wealth that we've accumulated in our homes is because we have decided that your job shouldn't provide that security blanket anymore, that a pension shouldn't, that you should sort of have to fend for yourself in this large market economy. Your mortgage going up, and the value of your home going up seems to benefit you, but it really benefits the banks that package your mortgages into securities, and the banks that make the loans, and the real estate industry that thrives on it. And again, not that these things are inherently evil in any way. This is just a choice we've made. And so as I was looking at a way to write about what was bedeviling me about the United States, and this idea of labor, not as a political idea, but as a simple, elegant ideal of how it is we lift everyone up, and the ideal that my dad lived with as the union president of the Steelworkers Union at Kaiser Aluminum in Washington State, Spokane, and the way in which he would just matter-of-factly go about his job, making sure that all of his members had the protections that he felt were necessary. And so that brought me to this idea of writing about a time and a place when I felt like unions and labor were at their beginning, almost an origin story, a kind of union ideal almost. And that brought me back to a story that I happened to know about from my days at the newspaper. One of the things I miss about a newspaper, I was talking to another reporter here, was the morgue, which sounds like a horrible place, but it was the greatest place. Every newspaper clipping would be filed in the morgue, in the old files, and you could just go open files. And I think it must have been Tom Foley's last election, and I was in the morgue, and I happened to pull the Fs out, that I came across the file of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and found out that this incredible suffragist and labor leader had been in Spokane in 1909 and had led these free speech riots that at the time were one of the most profound expressions of both free speech and the power of labor in this early sort of labor war. Of course, I'm stealing a little bit the first triumph that Elizabeth Gurley Flynn had, because it was actually right down the street here in Missoula. About a month before Spokane, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, her husband Jack Jones, who was a labor organizer, Frank Little, another IWW wobbly organizer, and a Forest Service employee, I believe, were arrested for speaking on soapboxes. About 70 people were arrested in Missoula, thrown in jail. The IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, the Wobblies as they would later be called, they had really just one trick, which was when we get arrested, we're going to make terrible pains in the asses of ourselves. They would sing in jail. They would all demand their own trials. They would become such nuisances that to arrest them was to cause the city more problems. So after arresting about 70 people and dealing with them for about 10 days, and the songs coming out of the jail and the other places where they put the vagrants who had come to town to protest, Missoula set them free. And then they set their eyes on Spokane. Now, Spokane in 1909, one of the other things that drew me to this story is, if you're writers, I will tell you, you owe it to yourself to write about the most interesting period in your city's history. And as I looked at Spokane in 1909, I couldn't believe it was the same city I'd grown up in. It was doubling in size every 7 years. By 1909, there were almost 120,000 people living in Spokane, 250 bars, a wild frontier city that was transforming immediately into this sophisticated, wealthy place. Of course, being in Montana, all about the Copper Kings. Spokane had its own Copper Kings who had made their money in mining in the silver mines and the Coeur d'Alenes, but they also had the banks and the hospitals. It was a sort of drain for all of this wealth. And so Spokane in 1909, it's almost hard to picture just how cosmopolitan and wild it was. On one end of town, you might have these incredible vaudeville shows. On the other end, you would have opera and some of the highest entertainment of the time. If you were a performer in 1909, 1910, and you looked at your West Coast schedule, you'd say, "Oh my God, I've got to go to Seattle. That place smells like sewage, and it's just full of wharf rats. But at least I've got San Francisco and Spokane on the schedule." It was considered, probably the second best entertainment option in the West. And so to write about Spokane in that period, for me, someone who'd grown up there and had lived through Spokane during such a long, stagnant period. I think before this book, the most probably famous thing I'd written about Spokane was in my short story collection, We Live in Water. And I have a essay in there talking about poverty and about the sort of poverty of spirit, I suppose, too. And it's called Statistical Abstract for My Hometown, Spokane, Washington. And in that essay, I quote a whole bunch of real and made-up stats about my hometown, including my favorite one, number 6, which is Spokane, Washington has more adult men per capita riding children's BMX bikes than any city in the country. And it was my first experience with something going viral on the internet. Pretty soon people in Turkey are sending me pictures of grown men on bikes with their knees up around their ears. But to write about Spokane at this other time, and also this time when it was on the progressive map as a place in which Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and some of the other IWW leaders came, was, really, it was a way to write about my city in a way that I hadn't before. And Spokane, like Missoula, has so much of the old architecture, so much of the ghost of those trains that ran through the city. If you think about the wealth of Spokane, there's a really easy comparison to make, and Montana during that time too. So remember, copper is discovered, copper is needed in electricity, the silver mines are flying, there's incredible timber, all the building that's going on in this period, all that timber that's needed, the agriculture of the Palouse, all that is coming through Spokane. But what else is coming through Spokane? 7 railroads. Everything pinches down through Spokane. You can take the High Line and you can get to Spokane. You can come down through Wyoming and get to Spokane. The trains pinch there before they go to Portland, before they go to Seattle, before they go to Vancouver. And so that focus of all of that wealth, all of that trade is very much like Silicon Valley now. That is where the wealth was concentrated for this burgeoning, these burgeoning industries that were coming together at the same time. So because of that, there's this incredible wealth. I'm in my 3rd straight 100-year-old house in Spokane. If you lived in Spokane when I did, you just thought, oh yeah, you can buy a 2.5-story brick mansion with an elevator for $180,000. That makes perfect sense because there was so much incredible housing from that period, and many of them were turned into apartment buildings. But there was also incredible poverty. Because all those trains came together, because all those industries came together, Spokane had a much larger vagrant population, itinerant workers, hobos, as I would lovingly have called myself. One of the great things in researching this book was finding out the distinction that those workers, those indigent workers, had of themselves. That they would say, if you traveled and worked, you were a hobo. If you traveled and dreamed, you were a tramp. And if you traveled and drank, you were a bum. And I loved the distinctions of those 3 things. But there wasn't the great, at least in that population, there was a kind of hierarchy of ambition, I suppose. And I've always liked that. So in writing about Spokane, and in starting to research this period, 1909, I found myself pushed to think about some of the authors whose work I love in describing real cities. I love when authors make up a place, but I love the way William Kennedy describes Albany in his cycle of novels. I love the way Elena Ferrante creates this Naples that makes you feel as if you're really there. And so I wanted to write about Spokane in that way. And so that led to this research. And my own favorite library, the Spokane Public Library in the Northwest Room, where I embedded myself for a couple of years. And when you start researching a novel like this, you begin sort of randomly. You want to know the sorts of things that, 1909, 1910, would someone walk in and turn on a light switch? Would the phone ring? Is there a party line? Who's on the phone? Who had phones? What time would a train leave from Spokane and arrive in Missoula? And if I know anything about fiction writing, it's that there are two things that you cannot mess up or you will be beaten to death by angry readers. One is firearms. You get that wrong and someone for sure will tell you. And the other is trains. There are train enthusiasts who I'm sure have read this book and say, well, that train to Taft didn't go to Missoula. And I sort of have this dream of writing a book in which it's all made up train times, and like every revolver shoots 27 shots, and just to see how angry I can make those certain readers, you know, like you get on a train in Spokane and 2 hours later you're in Chicago. I just think that would be great fun. But that led me to a great deal of research and to sort of figure out how I wanted to frame this novel. Now, if you've read it, you'll notice that that the book is very much written in a way that isn't always straightforward. There are these third-person sections that describe the two main characters, Ryan and Gregory, Rye and Gig Dolan, and then there are these first-person sections that come in. And those first-person sections, to me, were a way to do a couple of things. One, to have this novel feel teeming. Every time I looked at these photos of Spokane from 1909, streetcars with people hanging off them, the city just full of both itinerant workers and wealthy people heading, to eat at the Davenport restaurant. I wanted that teeming feel. I wanted it to feel the way another one of my favorite novels, E.L. Doctorow's Ragtime, feels, as if the novel is just spilling out with all of its people. I also started envisioning the novel itself as the central motif of the novel, which is the Spokane River. That river, the way it comes through the city and explains the reason for the city being there, explained the native people who, of course, were driven from that place and who lived there for generations and generations before. And then the river both features in the novel, frames it in a way, but I also started thinking of it as a metaphor for the way the novel would exist. Those third-person sections would be the sort of main channel, and then I would bring these tributaries in, these undercurrents, these stories that would pick up the pace of the river by adding more water. Once I sort of fell upon that idea, I have to tell you, this novel became so much fun to write. To be able to all of a sudden wander off into the voice of a character like Ursula the Great. Ursula the Great is a vaudeville singer, and in the midst of this research at the Spokane Library, when I'm going over old newspapers, 4 different newspapers at that time that I read in microfilm, and reading through those newspapers, looking to see how much did a pair of pants cost and how much was a ticket to the theater. And I got so caught up in vaudeville that I just really wanted to write a vaudeville singer. And I was reading some of these incredible acts, including the fabulous Fritz, who would get on stage and punch any animal that you brought up. So you could bring any animal in and Fritz would knock it to the ground, just like something out of Blazing Saddles. And I always carry a notebook with me, and I was jotting down ideas in my notebook a year into my research, maybe more, of this novel, and I wrote Ursula the Great sings and dances with a wild cougar. And I got home that night, and I was looking through my notes, and I thought, did I see that or make it up? And so I had to go back to the library the next day and look through the ads for these shows, and I realized I had made this character up. And in fact, I thought, why would she be called Ursula if she dances with a cougar? Because Ursula is a bear name. Wouldn't she dance with a bear? And then I had to give a backstory for why she's called Ursula. And at that point, for the historical fiction writer, it's a really good signal that it's time to fire the research department and really ramp up the fiction writing department. I was so in 1909 in my head at that point, and gleefully so, that by then the novel had really started to take form for me. And that's when it's such a great joy. And it was such a great joy to walk around Spokane during that time, to stand in front of the very houses that I was writing about, to stand on the streets where there are still streetcar tracks, and imagine this whole novel sort of taking place around me. It's always such a great thrill when that happens. And I still remember too the moment when it really sort of hit me. I was on my bicycle. I often ride out and get, I have the work habits of a hobbit. So I was about to have second breakfast, and I had realized I'd been reading about John Sullivan, who's one of the real historical figures in this book, and I realized I was a block from his house. And so I rode around the block, and I stood in front of this decrepit, falling apart old house, and I was like, oh my God, this is... It's the history is so real. I have to tell you, it wasn't until the first edition came out that I realized I was standing in front of the wrong house. And my old newspaper editor will not be surprised. Luckily, with fiction, you don't have to write a correction. You just correct it for the next edition. But I had the numbers off by 3. So, but that house was still standing. John Sullivan's house was still standing. But that brings me to a really interesting and difficult part of writing this particular novel. This is my 10th book, my 7th novel, and the thing that surprises me every time is that I feel like I'm starting over. And it's because I may have written a novel, but I haven't written this novel. And every novel creates its own unique issues that shock you. You just think, you can't believe how hard it is to figure out how to get all these moving pieces together, especially when you're alternating first person and third person, when you are writing some characters to the point of their very death. And the only reason you're doing that is because you've never seen that before. You think it might be cool. There are all these moments when you've made these choices that make writing a novel so hard. But one of the hardest ones here for me was deciding, with a story so based in reality, how much of this should I keep real? How much of the true story should I tell? Especially with someone like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. Now, I talked about this book, being dedicated to my dad and my brother, and in part because as I was writing it, when I wrote Beautiful Ruins, which was my most successful book and the novel before this one, I really set out to write a book that my mom would have loved. She had just passed away, and I wanted to write something she would love. And with this book, I wanted to write something that my dad would love. And so I wanted it to not just be a historical novel, but my dad loved cowboy stories. He loved stories about the West. And I wanted to write a sort of last Western, not the last Western. I'm sure others will be written, but that last period when Spokane is like Deadwood, but with 120,000 people in it. When you're just as likely to see a shootout on the street as you are to see an opera singer. That period when these things were colliding together this way. And the more I worked on this novel, the more I kept thinking about Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and her central role in it. And we grew up next to a drive-in movie theater, the East Trent Drive-In Theater. And I remember we moved in, and my dad was kind of excited. He put lawn chairs on the roof of the flat garage, and we were going to watch whatever was on. I don't think Dad realized just how in 1977, 76, just how blue the movies had gotten. They were not for children, so we didn't get to watch House of 1001 Pleasures that night. We had to go to bed, but we did end up building this tree fort where we would get to watch movies from such a far distance, although it was like looking at a postage stamp. If you can imagine the worst seats in deep center field and then trying to see like a movie screen over home plate, that's how far away it was. But I still remember all these great movies, and I loved the Clint Eastwood Westerns, and my dad loved those movies. And the more I worked on The Cold Millions, the more I thought of it as a kind of Western, as Elizabeth Gurley Flynn as the Clint Eastwood character, riding into this corrupt town, challenging the powers that be, also like protesting for the emancipation of the vagina, which I don't think Clint Eastwood ever did. But Elizabeth Gurley Flynn did. In 1909, this this woman who is a decade from having the right to vote is standing on street corners defying even union leaders who didn't want a pregnant labor activist on the street. In both Missoula and Spokane, she was defying these people. And so I really wanted, as I wrote this big adventure story around these two invented characters, Rye and Gig Dolan, I wanted to honor the real stories. And so most of what Elizabeth Gurley Flynn does in the novel, she did in real life. Much of her dialogue comes from speeches. I did make up a scene in Taft, Montana, because I always wanted to write about Taft. But almost everything else, really comes from things that she said and things that she did. John Sullivan, the police chief I was telling you about, similarly. And so as the novel started coming together, it was this balancing act, honoring those true stories, and also the true stories of the Spokane tribe, which were also very important to me. We grew up just downriver from or upriver, from the horse slaughter camp. And if you've read the novel, you will have a quick history of the way indigenous people were treated in Spokane. After the battle at Steptoe Butte, Colonel George Wright came through with soldiers, and there was a brief skirmish on the West Plains, but the tribe kept setting fires and running away, and they couldn't catch them. And so the cavalry descended into the river valley and burned every village they found, all the caches of food. They captured 800 ponies and put them in a big pen, all the wealth of the tribe, and then they shot them all. And the Spokane tribe wasn't even one of the warring tribes at the time. And the Spokanes, the Kalispels, the Palousas, many tribes would camp along the river there. But the death of those 800 horses, growing up, we knew that you could still see horse bones in the 1970s at the horse slaughter camp. That's how recent that history was. The golf course that we played at was still called Hangman because that's where the tribal leaders were hanged after this brief rebellion. And so you don't want your fiction to overpower those stories. You want them to be in service of those stories. So I think that was probably the big challenge for me. I'm going to end with a quick story about probably my favorite moment, my favorite reception for this book, which is an alternative high school near my house called the Community School. Now, the Community School is this innovative school that takes kids who may not have had success in other high schools and finds a way to channel their energies in different ways. And they have this history teacher who said, they just get so bored reading history. And so we decided with our history class, we would have them read The Cold Millions. And he said, this is not an avid reading group, so we weren't sure how it was going to go. He said, but then I had this great idea. I gave the book out the first day, and most of them were doodling or looking on their phones. And he said, so I decided we'd take a field trip. And so So this teacher marched the students out the school door about 10 blocks to the house I was telling you about, and he read this section to them. This is late in the book. It's going to be giving something away, but it's not that integral to the plot. To the point in 1911 where the police chief, John Sullivan, meets his end. His wife has gone to a play, and he's, of course, sitting in a chair in his house. And that's when the window, this is from John Sullivan's voice, and that's when the window behind me cracked like a bird hit it, and I tried to get up to check, but I had been stung in the back, and my chest was tight like 500 pounds was on me. The bullet had come out my chest and was in my lap. I carefully set the bullet on the table, evidence. I would die if I didn't move, so I forced myself up, stumbled to the telephone, and remembered that 2 days earlier our line had been cut. But it was fixed now, for it was department policy, no captain be without a phone. And the operator came on and said, police desk, and Ed Person was the sergeant. And I said, send a wagon. And Ed said, where to? And I said, 1320 West Cinto. And Ed said, why, that's your house, John. And I said, I know it's my house, John. It's where they shot me. And the idea that John Sullivan had called in his own shooting, had picked up the bullet and set it down for evidence, and then that teacher pointed and said, that happened right here, at the very house I'd ridden past. And this was my second favorite part, was the next day he said, every student was just bent over the book. And they all said, "Can we have more reading time?" And he said, "I wanted to get it on tape and take it to my principal," because he said that would be an immediate raise. I said that was my second favorite moment. My favorite moment was not long after that. I was walking to the Y, and the community school doesn't have a gymnasium, so they use the YMCA by my house as their gym. And I had just finished destroying the dreams of some younger basketball players who looked at me and thought they could probably get one over on me, and I must have had 40 points. I don't know. I was incredible anyway. And we were walking out of the Y, and in is walking this group of kids that was pretty rough-looking, tatted, and goth dressing, and various piercings. And all of a sudden, I hear, "Hey, you wrote a book!" And me and the basketball players and I all turned, and I said, "I did." And he said, "The Cold Millions, that was pretty good." And I said, "Thank you." And they all walked into the gym, and the basketball players looked at me, and I was like, when the jumper's fallen, it's fallen. So, but it was this incredible feeling for someone who'd grown up in Spokane and who had watched, that place where, the most remarkable thing was grown men on BMX bikes. I've watched Spokane just blossom, as so many places have, as I know this place has, as they've just become the culture has risen, the economy has risen, the arts are incredible in Spokane. It's really an amazing place to be, and yet its own history the place doesn't know, and especially that period of history, that late Western period when we were just becoming the culture we are now, when labor was struggling to try to close the gap that the Gilded Age had caused, that we've somehow brought back again. To bring Spokane readers back to that moment was such a thrill, and especially those readers, for whom that might be the first adult novel that some of them had read, and so it was thrilling. And just because I'd shot so well that day, that was also thrilling. So I'll invite Commissioner Slotnick back up, and he'll ask me some questions. But please, if you have any questions, I can drone on forever. I'll try not to, but any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Let's do. Okay, so first, thank you so much. That was beautiful and really fun.
Thanks.
So I'm going to just start with 2 questions, and then we'll get to y'all. So, our first question. Obviously, in this book, the public conversation around labor, it almost felt like a character in the book itself.
Yeah.
And you said you wrote this in 2017, 18, 19, a time, in a way, really different than ours right now in terms of labor. So, as you all know, in the recent past, we have the UPS strike, have the writers' strike, UAWs going on strike, Starbucks. There was attempts at Amazon warehouses in the recent past. Do you think, is it possible to kind of draw a line for you, or what do you think about these 2 things?
If you're asking if I take credit for the recent
I want to
gains,
give you credit.
Yeah, I wish I could take credit. I think often what you're trying to do as a novelist is feel the zeitgeist and feel what's in the air. And I think a lot of people were feeling a lot of the same things in the air. There's a reason that characters are named Rye and Gig. Gig is the gig economy. It is, you have only your body. If you worked in if you worked in a timber camp the way Gig and Rye did, and you cut your foot off, there was no medical treatment. Sometimes they would take the beginning of your pay as a sort of medical post, and then you had the right to go see a doctor. But if you couldn't afford to pay that, you were just sent out. I read stories about, there was a young woman on the East Coast who had 2 jobs in fast food and was an Uber driver, and she froze to death in her car. And we still have not figured out a way to provide basic, decent health care for people. And the more you know how much of your check now goes to your medical insurance. We all know these are broken systems, and so with labor, I think looking for a way to remedy those systems. And I think, again, I'm not saying I'm not unlike my great cousin. I'm not a union organizer, but I'm very much a believer in that collective bargaining idea that you can solve so many of those problems. So I do think it was sort of starting to be in the air at that time, and I'm really pleased to see. I'm on strike now. I'm a member of the Screenwriters Guild. Yeah. So if any of you are studio bosses, I will be taking a pipe to your kneecaps after this. So. I won't really. No. That's another cliche.
Great. Thanks. So when thinking about the characters in this book, two really stood out in terms of their kind of strength of will and backbone and the depth of their conviction, both of them women, in a time, as you pointed out, 11 years before they could even vote. I'm obviously speaking about Ursula and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. And so would you mind speaking to that and see if I got that right?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think I always envisioned that Elizabeth Gurley Flynn would take up even more of the novel. It's funny, this has happened to me a couple times where you sit up in the middle of the night and you think, I have a novel without a protagonist. It happened to me with Beautiful Ruins, and then with this novel too, I thought, Rye is in many ways not the hero of the novel. He's almost the field upon which this game is played. And Elizabeth Gurley Flynn is sort of the protagonist of the novel. And yet, my editor, a terrific editor named Jennifer Barth, her biggest contribution to the novel was saying, you have too much Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. She's more interesting sort of in the background a little bit. And one of the big issues in writing a proletariat novel, a novel set around some of these issues, is speeches. Her main job was to go give speeches, and you don't want to read a novel with speech after speech after speech. So I ended up taking so many pages of her out, and I felt like she was in some ways a stronger character because of that. Almost as if there's a sort of negative space around this character. Look at the time of the life that she's having. And if you haven't read her autobiography, or one of two, Rebel Girl, I encourage you to, because it's stunning to read. And so much of her early background comes from that book. And there was one scene that just floored me, I guess, being a parent. It was her mother, who was a suffragist herself, who worked hard to find the only woman in New York to deliver her daughters, who told Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, I want you to be, to do what you want, to live your life. And what's she do? She's going to go marry a miner and live in Montana, live in Butte. And Jack Jones, Jack was also a labor guy, but he wanted her at the kitchen, and she was pregnant. She'd already lost one baby. Well, now she's pregnant again. She's going to return home to Butte, where the average miner is going to live to 38. Her son is probably going to end up Fred is going to end up in that same mine. And she's felt this calling. And it's felt like such an incredible moment in this person's life. People didn't leave their husbands in 1909 the way she does. And so that point in her life. Now, as I was writing that character, though, I was really taken by the fact that this is not the typical way that a woman wielded power in 1909. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn is sui generis. She's one of a kind. And so I wanted to show another kind of power. And I was having so much fun writing Ursula. And there are moments when the characters sort of announce themselves to you. It always sounds kind of magical when you say that. But I was writing Ursula, and her sister tells her, I'm worried about you. You have terrible taste in men. And Ursula says, well, then let's get on with it. Let's bring me some then. And there was that moment when I thought, I want that character to exist as a sort of counterpoint to the ways in which women had to navigate this incredibly, demeaning and unfair, broken system. And she also, as I said, was just so much fun to write. She also had, to me, the greatest exit of the novel, too. Writing the end of the novel was such great fun, writing her departure, too.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'll hand this off to anybody else. Here, and then you get to hand the mic to the next person, okay?
Why did you choose War and Peace? Were there other things you were thinking of?
First of all, I love War and Peace. And I'm very aspirational when I write fiction. I became a writer because so many books moved me in ways that nothing else ever did. And War and Peace was one of those books. It's also a novel in which characters are find themselves all of a sudden overtaken by world events. And that to me was Rye. He just wanted to quietly go about his business. And as he describes it, history is like a parade sometimes. It just, marches right through. And so that made me think of the characters in War and Peace who all of a sudden find themselves in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars. But it's also, that book is really about the drive toward, a sort of Tolstoy's sort of agrarian idea of peace and fairness and a sort of acceptance. There's a moment in War and Peace in which Prince Andrei believes he's dying on the battlefield, and and he sees a comet fly over his head, and in that moment he thinks, what was this all about? What was life all about? And so that to me was sort of the way I envisioned Rye, having this sweeping historical movement pick him up and then sort of drop him where he was. The book has the exact same numbers of chapters as War and Peace. It has an epilogue like War and Peace, the same number of sections. Often I'm just doing that for myself. I don't expect anyone else to notice. And then the book owes a great, as I said, it owes something to libraries. There's that scene in, as I said in the beginning, Lem Brand's study where Rye is sitting there with this incredibly wealthy man, and he is looking around this library and floor-to-ceiling books, and he asks, do you have War and Peace? And Lem Brand has to look to his assistant and goes, yeah, we probably do. And he doesn't even know, his books are probably unopened. And the heartbreak that creates in Rye, knowing that his brother is rotting in a cold jail cell with 500 other protesters while this wealthy man sits in a library he won't even use. And one of the things that destroyed me in my research was finding out about what they called the Great Hobo Library. Now, you are carrying everything you own in a little pack, a little sack that you carry on a stick, a bindle. You're a bindle stiff, so you're carrying that thing. And you don't have much room, and yet so many of these guys would carry a book. And then they would get to the next jungle or campfire, and they would say, I've got Tolstoy. Does anyone have Thoreau? Does anyone have Rousseau? And they would trade books this way. And in this way, the Great Hobo Library would make its way around the world. And so imagining that gig only had 2/5 of War and Peace became an aspirational thing too. This book represents more to him than just the story. This is what it is to be a human being. And that's why I love the scene that sometimes when you're writing, it's embarrassing because you make yourself laugh or cry. And when Rye goes into the Spokane Library, a Carnegie Library, which I know you had here too, beautiful old Carnegie Library, to get the other books of War and Peace, and he's treated like a human. I mean, that's really one of the only places in which he isn't mistreated because of his class and status. As I was typing that, I just had these tears, just rolling down my face because, that just makes me. I get sappiest when I think about that stuff. So that's what War and Peace meant for me as I was writing the novel. And if you ever get a chance to see the play Natasha, Pierre, and the Great Comet, it's amazing, and it sort of takes the heart out of War and Peace and has that moment with Prince Andrei in the battlefield depicted so beautifully. So thank you. It was a great question.
Hi, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I love the themes of extraordinary wealth and labor. I love your slide. I can really connect with my own perspective and my own life experiences through labor. What I'm really curious as such a successful author is, if you've had the opportunity to be in rooms with people of extraordinary wealth and hear them react to your book, and I want to learn more about their perspective in response to your book.
I said, Elon, you should, that's a really good question. I don't know if I've been in rooms with really wealthy people. I think, most of the people that I know who even, I don't think wealth in any way, I think it was William James who said, no one ever got incredibly rich without stealing. And I don't know if that's true or not. William James said it, I didn't. But I think there is a level. I just read this incredible story about Leland Stanford, who started Stanford University, and the stories of how some of these massive fortunes are created are really pretty despicable. And is it possible to have to get that kind of massive wealth now without, driving tribes out, without destroying the environment? I don't know. Most of the people who tell you that they've read your book are going to tell you they like it. I've yet to have a billionaire come up and argue with me about it, but I don't know how many of them come to readings. But again, it's not as if wealth is, it's not as if poverty is a determination of good character either. It's, but I do think, it's still something we haven't come to terms with. That chart is not narrowed very much in the last few years, and however we do it, there has to be some way to recreate that middle class. If I were to put the middle class chart up there, it would do the exact same thing. I think, I'm not an economist, but I think those charts sort of speak for themselves. But it makes, I'm so interested in your question. I'm gonna see if I'm gonna have to look and see if I have any emails from any of the Gateses or. But mostly what I've found is readers who love fiction the way we love fiction. They get taken away by the story. They love the characters. And I think if this one has a message, I hope it's not didactic or overbearing. I hope it's a sort of subtle message, straightforward message of humanity. Yes, over there. Oh, I thought I saw a question.
Thanks for this book. It's really wonderful.
Thank you.
So I was wondering if you had anything you wanted to say about Early Reston. I think he's a very interesting presence in the book.
Yeah, Early Reston was such an interesting character to write because I wanted to make him charming, first of all, but often when you're writing, you're sort of playing with almost writing assignments for yourself. And so, as I said, if you've read the novel, many of the characters narrate their own deaths, which I did for two reasons. One, because in writing historical fiction, which I hadn't, I kept thinking these people were walking these streets. They were here. They could speak their own stories. But another thing I wanted to do was write a character with some real ambiguity, where maybe I didn't even know what Early Reston's motives were. If any of you read a book called Big Trouble by J. Anthony Lucas? Oh my gosh, it's such an incredible book. It's about the same period. If you find yourself wanting to read more about labor and Pinkertons and dastardly things, read J. Anthony Lucas's Big Trouble, which is about the murder of the former governor of Idaho, Steunenberg, I believe his name is, and he was bombed by an anarchist at his house. Well, the anarchist they arrested, a man named Harry Orchard, claimed sometimes to be a Pinkerton, sometimes to be an anarchist, sometimes to be something else. And he had this fuzziness about him that made me want to create that with Early Reston. There's a moment where Early Reston, though, gives Rye a speech in Taft, and he says, you're about money the same way the rich people are about money. You want $1, they want $1 million. What's the difference? And I really wanted to make sure that I believed that I believed Early Reston believed his speech. I believed that he believed this sort of anarchist message that he was spreading. It's really fun writing a character who you don't even know if you have entire access to. And I've done that a couple of times. I have a novel called Citizen Vince, in which a character named Vince Camden votes in the 1980 presidential election. And he's a criminal. He's in the witness protection program. And another criminal is demanding to know who he voted for, and he won't tell him. And he's like, I voted for Reagan. Did you? Said, no, I voted for Carter. Did you? No, I voted for John Anderson. See, I can tell you anything, and you won't know. And it almost drives this man to kill him. He's so frustrated that because felons don't have the right to vote, and this guy's wanted to vote. And I don't tell the reader who he voted for. And it cracked me up how many people would come up to me and say, yeah, but really, who did he vote for? And I would say, I made him up. He's a fictional character. And I know, but who did he vote for? And that's one of the books that's been published in, I think, 26 countries. And so I'll get these lovely letters from Croatia. I very much enjoy your book, but I must know, who is Vince vote for? And I'll be like, I don't know, Carter, Anderson, who knows? So, I'm not a big believer, like some authors, in total ambiguity where, you've closed a book sometimes and you think, are there 8 pages missing? And one of the things I wanted to do with this book, while I left some ambiguity about perhaps early Reston's motives, was to not, this is 100 years ago. Or more than 100 years. I wanted you to see the full lives of these characters. And I talked about my love for other books and how often I pattern them, the things I'm writing after books that I love, and realizing that the first episode of this novel, the first thing that takes place in the river chronologically, takes place at Plants Ferry, right near the horse slaughter camp in 1864, and that the epilogue with Rye takes place in 1964. And our history in the West is so recent. It's not 26 generations, it's our grandparents, our great-grandparents. And that idea that you could encapsulate the whole history of Spokane, 1864 to 1964, the year my dad went to work at Kaiser, the year before I was born, that you could encapsulate an entire city's growth and history in that time seemed to me kind of amazing, and then reminded me of my favorite book, 100 Years of Solitude. And so, in a way, I could write my 100 Years of Spokane solitude between that 1864 and 1964, but also tell you in that epilogue what happened to those characters. I could honor the epilogue in War and Peace while also honoring, the real end of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's life. I don't want to keep you guys all day, but I will.
I snuck in a little bit late, so I apologize if you've hit on this already. I enjoyed your book so much, coming from a union family, and I really appreciated it. And that was before I got to the very end where you fast forwarded. And I appreciated that section so much of the main character enjoying his secure retirement and then being grumpy about his Alex P. Keaton children, worshiping the free markets. And my question was just that almost felt like the wake-up call for me at the end of the book, like, hey, we've gotten complacent here. Was that your intent? And what was your inspiration to do that at the end of the book?
I've had some labor activists sort of angry about the end. They want Rye to become, they want Rye to become, an agitator and really get involved in it. And I thought about that, but it didn't really fit Rye's personality, first of all. All he ever wanted, and when you write, if any of you are fiction writers, I firmly believe in my hero Kurt Vonnegut's advice that you need to give your character something to want. And what Rye wanted always was that sense of security and home. And that's what Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was fighting for. When I said Rye was the field on which this novel was played, the fact that he could have that quiet life, that he could raise 3 kids, that he could say, you can love your kids and still think they're the ripest assholes in the world. Giving him that normal life was, in a way, the great triumph. Now, There was a moment in 2016 that I'm not proud of when I called each of my daughters and both of my daughters and left them the voicemail that said, tomorrow morning you'll wake up with the first female president. How amazing that the country's come that far. And they've never let me forget it. And I remember after that election thinking, seeing my kids and seeing a real sort of brokenheartedness in them, that this was the country they lived in. And I remember my son, my wife went to bed, and my son was just pacing around angry and angry at the election. I said, you know what? You're going to be fine. And he looked at me and said, I'm not worried about me. And I just went, oh, just destroyed me. And in that moment, I realized a lot of what we do is for the next generation. And when I looked around over those next few years at who was in the leading edge of this protest that Elizabeth Gurley Flynn would have been in, it was the Parkland shooting survivors. It was young people walking out of schools for climate change. It was, that leading edge isn't where we didn't get to Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's, the workers own the factories. We got to a place where there was a middle class. The leading edge pushes us to a certain place, and that's what the value of that kind of protest. And so there's a moment late in the book when Rye says, how do you keep going? Elizabeth Gurley Flynn says, men sometimes ask me, how do you keep going only to lose? And she said, only to lose the war. And she said, you know what? No one wins the war. We're all going to die. But to win a battle now and then, how amazing is that? And to put that at the end of a novel where she had just won a battle in Spokane was, to me, that kind of wake-up call. That we pick our battles, we won't win them all. We might not even agree on what they are, but we're driven to make the world better for the young people. And we're inspired to watch the steps. I'm inspired to watch the steps that they take fighting for social justice and for a better world. Maybe another question. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I just read that line like a couple hours ago,
did you? Yeah.
And it got me emotional. But anyways, my question is: you mentioned that one of the main challenges for writing this book was finding maybe like a happy balance between history and fiction.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if you could talk more about that and what that meant for you, and also like in your career generally, like your thoughts on that.
You use the word happy, not me. There's nothing happy about writing a novel. No, it is. I actually love it. It's I think, as I said, E.L. Doctorow's Ragtime for me was I love finding a model and thinking and just reading it and thinking, how does that book incorporate the real Houdini? What's real and what isn't? And that makes the reading experience so incredibly rich. And so that was maybe the first step, was seeing the way in which E.L. Doctorow in that book uses an almost documentary voice. He doesn't apologize for what he's telling you. And so I had to step back and create a bigger storytelling voice than maybe I would normally use. In those third-person sections, I had to tell you, Spokane was the crossroads between frontier and this. There were this many bars. There was this much. I had to almost bring the camera to a higher level to tell the story. And once I did that, the great joy in writing is finding that voice and really sticking with it. And then to be able to juxtapose that with the real people. There were times when I found myself questioning it. I thought, all right, this scene in Taft is so interesting, but it didn't happen. I don't know that Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was ever nearly robbed. I don't know that a guy who'd been blown up was hired by the these things didn't happen. I'm inventing them. And at that moment, as I said, I had recently fired the research department and was leaning heavily on the fiction department. And a novel has to work as fiction first. And so I gave myself those I gave myself those breaks, I suppose, to be able to write fiction, because it really did freeze me up many times, and I would be sticking so much to the research. But in the end, as I said at the end of the novel, don't mistake this for nonfiction. This, and it's one of the reasons I included a bibliography at the end, a list of books that I used, because I do want people to go back and read the real story. In Spokane this spring, the museum is doing an event, and I could tell some of the museum workers were a little uneasy, because it's like, do we have to tell people that there is no Ursula the Great, and so I'm really clear that this is historical fiction. But I do believe what I at the end in my acknowledgments, I said, and I believe both these things, as Albert Camus said, fiction is the lie through which we tell the truth. And as Jessamine West said, fiction reveals the truth that reality obscures. And as my kids said, Dad, that sounds made up. It is made up, and that's important to me to always point out. But the heart of it is, really does come from those real stories.
Thank you for writing Cold Millions. It was a brilliant and beautiful book.
Thank you.
And coming from Butte, from Mines and Union, I just have one question. What could we do to get you to move to Butte and write the great American novel?
Poisonville, yeah. I would love to write a Butte novel. It would be about Evel Knievel. I think my dad might still own a trailer in Butte. I'm not sure. I may actually. It was hard to not bring Elizabeth Gurley Flynn to Butte, because that's where she had spent a little bit of time. And Butte in 1909, as you know, was denuded of all trees. There was a sickness rising off of that place. That would be an amazing place. There's a really good podcast called A Death in the West. Have you heard that? Which is about Frank Little's murder in Butte. And that really captures the sense of what an incredible place it was. And you talk about the wealth in Spokane. I mean, Butte was its match, and in a smaller city, of course. So, yeah. Thank you for that. Is that it? I'll happily sign books. Oh, one more question. And then you people probably have dinner reservations.
Just curious if you are working on another book right now that we should be aware of. On a reader.
They have some great books over there. This is actually the worst one. Those are way better. So I encourage you to buy them. I have a book of short stories out now called The Angel of Rome, which is my most recent title. And that I tend to like the thing I just finished last. And I'm probably not probably different than most writers in that I tend to be working on two things simultaneously, and then one sort of takes over. I was working on The Cold Millions at the same time I was working on a kind of noir novel. I'm in a men's Shakespeare club. Yeah, that's as cool as it sounds. And we were reading the Merchant of Venice, and I create spoonerisms in my head all the time, so I kept hearing it as The Virgin of Menace, which I thought would be the greatest noir title ever. So I was writing The Cold Millions and The Virgin of Menace at the same time. And so I'm writing The Virgin of Menace and a basketball book. So one of those two will win and hopefully be out in about a year and a half, maybe two, depending on how fast I type after this. So, but I thank you all so much. Thank you for coming. Thank you for reading, and thank you for these great events. I'm so honored to have Missoula choose this book. Thank you.
I just, very quickly, I think we should clap again in a second. Thank you so much, Jess. Our wrap-up party for the Big Read is on October 11th, and it's a live performance of the Death in the West podcast that he just mentioned. So we invite you to come back for that. And thank you, Commissioner Slotnick. And again, thank you so much, Jess.